Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The hearings that Democrats decide to hold demonstrate their priorities, what they care about. We have a crisis raging on our southern border right now because of Joe Biden's lawless and open border policies. The head of the Biden Department of Homeland Security is informing its staff to prepare for up to 400,000 illegal immigrants crossing this month. And yet the Senate Judiciary Committee has not had a single hearing on the crisis on our southern border. Over 2 million illegal immigrants streaming into America, Democrats don't care. Hundreds of thousands of kids in cages, Democrats don't care. Every Democrat on this committee went on TV on and on about kids in cages, kids in cages. You now know what they were saying they didn't believe, because if they believed it, there are more kids in more cages that are more full now than there ever were, and not a Democrat on this committee cares. Hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants with COVID, Democrats don't care. Children by the thousands being physically and sexually abused by human traffickers, Democrats don't care. Drugs streaming across our border, Democrats don't care. Young women being trapped in sexual slavery by human traffickers, Democrats don't care. Well, what do they care about? Well, this illustrates what they care about. Democrats have one priority, and that is power, staying in power. That's why Democrats have had 4 hearings on amnesty. They look at 2 million illegal immigrants and they think, ooh, future Democratic voters, let's give them all amnesty. Never mind the abuses that happen. This is about power for our Democratic friends. But you know what? There's something they've had more hearings on than amnesty, and that is the federal takeover of election law and the Democratic power grab. There is nothing that is a higher priority for Democrats than staying in power. The Corrupt Politicians Act was so brazenly political, it was such a naked power grab, that Democrats have abandoned it where they realized they couldn't defend it with a straight face. So this is their fallback provision. Senator Leahy mentioned his version of the bill in the Senate. That was filed at 12:45 last night, is when committee members were notified of it. And there are a lot of terrible provisions in the bill, but let me just cover 2 briefly. Department of Justice preclearance for everyone Democrats don't like, and Department of Justice preclearance for everything Democrats don't like. Here's how it would work. Every state and local government across the country would have to submit certain voting changes. What voting changes? Well, anything like imposing voter ID on elections or preventing ballot harvesting, to Kristen Clark and Vanita Gupta, 2 partisan activists who haven't been shy about their hatred of voter integrity laws before those changes can go into effect. All right, spoiler alert. If it is a law protecting the integrity of the election, if it's a voter ID law, if it's prohibiting ballot harvesting, the partisan activists at the Department of Justice are going to object because they've been explicit they oppose all those laws. Similarly, any state and local government that the Democrats don't like, they have to submit every voting change to the same partisan activists. Let me give you an example of how crazy this is just by analogy. Can you imagine if Republicans proposed a law that said that states like California and New York and Illinois have to submit every law or policy affecting religious liberty or affecting firearms to a brand new division of the Department of Justice staffed almost entirely by activists who've been fighting in favor of religious liberty and in favor of the Second Amendment their entire time? And if these activists objected to the California or New York law, then the states couldn't implement them. That would be absurd. That's what the Democrats have done. And ironically, the Democrats claim they're protecting the right to vote. This bill is an assault on the right to vote. Why? Number one, ballot integrity acts like voter ID acts prevent voter fraud. Sadly, Democrats have looked at the bipartisan Carter-Baker provision, chaired by former Democratic President Jimmy Carter, and just about every recommendation on how to prevent voter fraud, they've turned on its head and said, we want more fraud because fraud benefits Democrats. But secondly, the laws that they want unelected bureaucrats to strike down are laws adopted by democratically elected legislatures in the states. You don't get to claim, as Senate Democrats do, that you favor democracy when you propose measures to stop democracy. Democracy means the voters decide. This bill is an assault on democracy because it says we don't care that 29 million people in the state of Texas decide we want voter ID in accordance with the views of 80% of Americans. We don't care. One unelected bureaucrat at the Department of Justice who happens to be a radical left-wing Democratic activist has the power to say to hell with democracy. We're striking down laws passed by democratically elected legislatures. This is a power grab, it's cynical, and it's wrong.
We will now turn to the first panel. On our first panel, we welcome the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Kristen Clark, back to the committee. Assistant Attorney General Clark is a lifelong civil rights lawyer. Spent her
promise to be nonpartisan and impartial. I'm sorry to say that I think neither of you have lived up to that promise. Within weeks of President Biden being sworn in, the Department of Justice dismissed a Civil Rights Division lawsuit it had against Yale University for explicit racial discrimination. Yale has a policy that discriminates against Asian Americans at admissions. It does so brazenly and openly. And yet, the Department of Justice decided that preventing racial discrimination did not fit within the purview of the Biden DOJ. Now, in your defense, you were not yet there, neither was Merrick Garland. So that was merely the initial political operatives of the Biden administration doing what they believed was consistent with the preferences of the president. But just this week, after you were there, after Merrick Garland was there, the Department of Justice issued a memorandum to the FBI instructing them to mobilize against parents across the country, parents of school kids, who have the temerity to show up at school boards and express their opposition to the teaching of critical race theory, a pernicious theory that divides us on racial lines, that tells school children the lie that America is fundamentally racist, that America is irredeemably racist, that all white people are racist. It spreads racial division. Many parents are understandably quite dismayed at schools that are teaching this to their children, sometimes as young as 5. And yet the Department of Justice looked at that issue and decided to label the parents objecting to this teaching as domestic terrorists. Did you participate in discussions about the memo before it was issued?
Senator, I can't talk about internal deliberations.
You can't talk about whether you participated in discussions about the memo?
No, but what I can tell you is that the Civil Rights Division will play a role going forward. The Attorney General has asked the department to undertake a review, and the division will participate in that review to determine how federal enforcement tools can be used to prosecute crimes.
Do you believe parents objecting to the teaching of critical race theory have civil rights in the democratic process?
I don't follow the question, Senator.
You don't understand the question whether parents objecting to critical race theory have civil rights?
The First Amendment is a core value in our democracy, and
I didn't say free speech. I said civil rights. School board meetings are democratic. They are petitioning your local government. Do they have civil rights that the voting rights gives a damn about?
Yet they have the right to express their view, to challenge the school boards, to ask.
And is it beneficial for the Attorney General to label them as domestic terrorists and direct the FBI to target them?
The Attorney General's memo deals with threats against public servants and says that threats against public servants are not only illegal, they run counter to our nation's core values.
Do you believe parents objecting at school boards are domestic terrorists?
I don't, Senator.
Do you believe Antifa are domestic terrorists?
I don't have a view about Antifa.
Do you believe the Black Lives Matter protesters who burned shops, who firebombed police cars, who murdered police officers, do you believe they're domestic terrorists?
Senator, I believe that we live in a society where people espouse different views, but what we don't want are threats.
You know, Ms. Clark,
or
it is
violence.
amazing that you're not willing to condemn people who are murdering police officers and firebombing cities because your politics aligns with them. But at the same time, when it comes to parents at school boards, you're perfectly comfortable with calling a mom at a PTA meeting a domestic terrorist. Ms. Clark, with all due respect, this demonstrates why the Democrat proposal to take someone with as long a partisan record as you have and to put you in charge of striking down any voting rights law in the country that you disagree with is nothing but a partisan power grab. Let me give another example, because your division has operated in a purely partisan way. The Department of Justice dismissed the civil rights lawsuits against the state of New York, the state of Pennsylvania, the state of Michigan for those governors' policies that sent COVID-positive patients into nursing homes, forced the nursing homes to take those patients, a decision, a political decision that resulted in tens of thousands of deaths. One of those governors, Andrew Cuomo, has now resigned in disgrace, and his staff had admitted they lied, underreporting the deaths that policy caused, and yet your division dismissed the lawsuit against those Democratic governors. How are we to see that as anything other than a purely partisan decision?
The letters that were issued to officials in the matters that you referenced were put together by career officials inside the department.
Career officials can't be partisan?
This department carries out its work free from political
Are you
interference.
testifying to this committee that there are no career officials in the Department of Justice who are partisan?
Partisanship does not impact the way that we carry out our
Except
enforcement
miraculously, you dismissed the lawsuits against Democratic governors, even when their policies may have caused the deaths of tens of thousands of people. You also dismissed a lawsuit that was brought against a medical center that had a pattern of discriminating against health care providers that, for conscience reasons, didn't want to implement abortions, even though clear federal law protects their civil rights. Why did you dismiss that civil rights lawsuit in contravention of federal law?
General Garland has made clear, and I agree, that partisanship has no place in the enforcement
Except
work
every decision
of
you
the
make
Justice
is partisan.
Department.
Your actions contradict those statements.